Last but not least, we have Winston Kyan, who holds a BA in Comparative Literature from Brown University and an MA and PhD in Art History from the University of Chicago. He has taught at Macalester College and the University of Utah, where he is currently the Associate Professor of Art History. His articles and essays have appeared in Art Bulletin, AmeriAsia Journal, Art Journal Open, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, and numerous edited volumes. He's currently working on 2 book projects, one on the intersection of filial piety in Buddhist art in medieval China, and the other on Asian American Buddhist visual culture.
Thank you, William, and especially many thanks to the organizers and donors and participants who have made all of this possible. So the talk of this title is Forced Incarceration, Buddhist Resistance, and the Art of Japanese Americans, 1942 to 1946. But what I really want to do is ask the question, what is Asian American art? While Asian American art begins in the 19th century as a material artifact, it has its roots in the 21st century as an academic discipline. And because it is such a new field, many of us here today approach it as an extension of our training in other fields. Some of us may identify as modernist art historians that want to integrate artists of Asian descent into the larger narrative of modern art. Some of us might identify as Asianist art historians that want to explore the references to Asia in Asian American art as a trans-Pacific phenomenon in which a painting, a photograph, a monument, etc. is both Asian and Western. Conferences such as this one allow these 2 extensions, rooted in very different forms of training, to converge. Hence, modernists might learn a bit about the Asian in Asian American art, while the Asianists might learn something about the modern in Asian American art. Indeed, without this convergence between modernists and Asianists, we cannot begin to meaningfully examine the question, what is Asian American art? Having said that, full disclosure, I am very much an Asianist trained in the research and analysis of traditional East Asian Buddhist art, who has now embarked on a project on Asian American Buddhist visual culture, of which the Japanese American internment forms a chapter. And I look forward to the comments of the modernists in the audience, and my apologies in advance for any misuse of terms. Events leading up to the Japanese American internment came to a head on December 7, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on the island of Hawaii. At that time, Hawaii was a U.S. territory, like Puerto Rico is today. Hawaii would not become the 50th state until 1959, but the attack on Pearl Harbor was seen as a direct attack on the U.S. The photograph on the left captures in stark contrast of black and white the devastation of powerful explosions and billowing smoke that killed 2,400 people and crippled the U.S. Western Fleet. Notably, the photographer has included at the top of his image palm tree fronds that remind us that all this happened in a tropical paradise. This led to feelings on the mainland U.S. of mass anger and suspicion of anyone who might have connections to Japan, which would include both first-generation Japanese immigrants and second- and third-generation Americans of Japanese descent who were born in the U.S. This led to the issuing of Executive Order 9066 by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, and the forced relocation of 120,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent from the West Coast to desolate internment camps in the interior of the country. They were only allowed to bring with them things that they could carry. In the middle, you see an example of the posters that were put up all over the West Coast as instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry that informed them of their upcoming relocation. Notably, no one was ever charged with a crime, no one was ever given a right to a trial, and no one was ever convicted of a crime. More than half of the 120,000 internees were Japanese Americans born in the U.S. who were denied their basic rights as U.S. citizens. The map on the right shows the various sites of the Japanese-American internment. Note the bold black line that follows the borders of California and splits Washington, Oregon, and Arizona into separate exclusion areas. Also note the dots that mark the various assembly centers where Japanese Americans were first sent while the relocation centers were being built. These include Tanforan outside of San Francisco and Santa Anita outside of Los Angeles. Then note the triangles which mark the 10 relocation centers, which was the official government name. Listing all 10 of them, we have Tule Lake and Manzanar in California, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Rower and Jerome in Arkansas, Grenada and Amache in Colorado, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, and Topaz in Utah. The peak populations in these camps range from 7,318 in Grenada, Amache, Colorado, to 18,789 in Tule Lake, California. So we are talking about camps the size of small cities. Lives were unnecessarily disrupted, people died, property and businesses unnecessarily lost, but for the most part, the resilience of the Japanese American community has led to its thriving in the 21st century. The one thing that has not fully recovered is the open display and pride in one's religion, namely Buddhism, which was the majority religion of most Japanese Americans before World War II. The next three sets of slides shows the rapid transformation in the reception of Buddhism from the 1930s to the 1940s. In these two images from the 1930s, we see public processions and gatherings in which race and religion are proudly displayed without fear of animus or reprisal. On the left, we see girls dressed as Buddhist goddesses parading down a Seattle street with a portable shrine in the background carrying a Buddhist divinity hidden from sight in honor of its sacredness. On the right, we have a gathering of the Young Buddhist Association of Tacoma, in which banners are proudly hoisted. The faces in the crowd, men and women, young and old, all beam with that unique glow when faith and community are openly celebrated. It was precisely this power of Buddhist organizations to provide community and leadership that led the US government to see it as a primary target to national security after Pearl Harbor. And the first people to be rounded up were Buddhist reverends, priests, and leaders. The association of Buddhism with the enemy led Japanese Americans, who were majority Buddhists, to not give up their faith, but rather to take it underground. The next set of slides shows the terror and tragedy that occurs when racial animus gets transposed to fundamentally peaceful religions. On the left, we see the conflagration of the Pahala Hongwanji Temple on the Big Island of Hawaii in 1942, during the height of anti-Japanese sentiment. The fire was caused by arson, and as with the burning crosses of the KKK, we are mesmerized by the flames, the very flames that seek to terrorize us. In contrast, the photo on the right is a moment of silence. Here we see the Reverend Naito of the Florin Buddhist Temple outside of Sacramento, quietly pulling shut the doors of his house of worship, Buddhist rosaries clutched in his hand, shortly before he and his congregation were interned. The next set of images shows how Buddhism had to go underground during the internment. On the left is a fascinating drawing of the Zen priest Yogen Senzaki preaching in the shadows in his barracks at Hart Mountain. We see a simple altar with offerings and a painting of a Buddha figure in the background. Notably, all these objects are small and highly portable, implying that they could be easily hidden as to not attract negative attention. Despite the palpable cold in the barracks, the deep connection between the Buddhist priest and the devotees before him emit a strong warmth captured in the dramatic contrast of light and shadow. Much of the powerful mood of this image comes from the hand of the artist, Estelle Ishigo, who was one of the few people not of Japanese descent to be interned at Hart Mountain. Estelle was a white woman who married a Japanese American man, and rather than separating from him, decided to follow him into the camps, even though the government warned her that she would not get special treatment there as a white person. A skilled artist, she was able to capture scenes of camp life that are rare and precious, since cameras were not allowed. In the photo on the right, we see another form of religion worship in the shadows. The figure facing us is Hiroko Terakawa, the daughter of a Buddhist priest. On the wall of a stall in the Portland Livestock Exposition, where she and her family were held before being shipped to a more permanent camp, we see a small image of a Buddha that is almost inconspicuous next to a large American flag. If these photos show us the Buddhist resistance to injustice as a religious practice, then the Buddhist objects created by Japanese American internees are even more powerful testaments to the capacity of art to express resistance. Arguably, this capacity for resistance is best seen in the diversity of Buddhist visual culture produced in the camps. On the left, we have one of the most impressive Buddhist altars built at the camps. Built by the master carpenter brothers Gentaro and Shinzaburo Nishiura at the Heart Mountain Camp, it is an enormous 5-foot-tall Buddhist altar made out of fine hardwood with a clear finish to reveal the wood grain. Camp newspapers would proudly report on the installation and commemoration of these altars, noting the specifics of their construction and materials. Reports would mention the lack of nails used in the joinery and the quality of the wood. Indeed, distinction would be made between altars made from scrap lumber and the painted over, which were then painted over with opaque colors, and altars made from fine wood imported into the camps and covered with a clear finish to reveal the wood grain, such as the example on the left by the Nishiura brothers. Eventually, networks of craftsmanship were established in which altars built at the Heart Mountain Woodworking shop would be shipped to other camps, such as Topaz in Utah. Take a moment to appreciate the incredibly detailed carving that showed the enormous skill and talent of the artists. The roof of the interior structure shows the careful attention to the bracketing systems and tiles that would comprise traditional architecture. We have a strong sense of miniaturization, an almost dollhouse-like scale that engenders feelings of intimacy and approachability towards the deities represented within. Under the miniaturized roof, we see 3 bays, with the central bay that reads the name of Amitabha Buddha, the central deity of the Pure Land School of Buddhism. This was the school of Buddhism that the majority of Japanese Americans belonged to. It is also the school of Buddhism that preached the power of reciting the name of Amitabha Buddha to secure release from any suffering. One can imagine that an altar such as this one would have been a source of great spiritual comfort for many internees. On the right is a carving of Kyan, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Kyan means the one who hears and sees all, and is named for his ability to respond to the suffering of all beings. In contrast to the large altar to the left, which in its materials, craftsmanship, and attribution to famous individuals, these 2 brother artists, signaled its status as art, the icon on the right is humble and unpretentious, but no less an expression of indomitable spirit. Here someone has carved, in the most simple fashion, a divinity that might give them comfort and inspiration in their time of need. The image is made from scrap lumber, whose main quality is its malleability to take forms. The wood is left unvarnished and uncolored. Its main function is not to express beauty, as it is to capture the iconographies of Buddhist aid. We see the open arms and beatific smile of the divinity. We also see flowing robes and swirling clouds, all meant to conjure the speed and immediacy of Kyan's arrival to the space of the devotee in need. What I find most notable about this image is that the carver has not only created a figure of Kyan, but a full-fledged icon with both a mandorla, or body halo, and the pointed silhouette of pre-modern Japanese icons. In other words, the object, while crudely executed in many ways, nevertheless references the art history of earlier eras. It is an object that shows as much pride in the history of Japanese art as it does devotion to Buddhist compassion. So in these two photographs here, we see wood workers in their shop. On the left, it's in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. This would have been the shop where the Nishiura brothers would have constructed their very elaborate altars that we looked at earlier. But here, these workers are also making furniture, because when the internees arrived, they had to make their own furniture. And typically, they were made out of very cheap scrap lumber. On the right, we have a wood carver at Rower, Arkansas. And here we see somebody who's more of an amateur. He would not have been at the level of the Nishiura brother who would make the elaborate altars, who's carving a very patriotic image of an eagle. And the one on the right would have been more similar to the carver that we assume would have done the Kyan that we were just talking about earlier. The more simple, naive type of style. I want to finish this presentation by just talking about these two comparisons. One of them is the monument to the Rower deceased at the Rower camp in Arkansas, dated to 1944. And the other one are the Heart Mountain suture stones that I show you on the left, so on the right. So the monument to the Rower deceased commemorates a cemetery at Rower. And I'm very fascinated by this monument because it combines references to Buddhism, especially Pure Land Buddhism, in very subtle and hidden ways beneath a overall sort of monumental structure that references American patriotism. So we see at the very top you have an eagle, and then a sphere, and then an obelisk-like pillar. And these would all reference traditional forms that we associate with American patriotism. At the bottom, though, we have very interesting tablets that are used in Japanese memorial services. These do not have any names on them, but the names are basically inferred. And then we also have a lotus, petals at the very base of the obelisk. And that, too, is a reference to Pure Land Buddhism. In Pure Land Buddhism, the belief is that by reciting the name of Amitabha at one's death, one can be reborn into the Pure Land, which is not really the ultimate state in Buddhism, which would be nirvana, or the cessation of rebirth. The Pure Land is seen as a kind of pit stop to that ultimate state. The Pure Land is a place where there is no suffering. That's why it's pure. And that's why it's called the Pure Land. So in Pure Land Buddhism, the belief is that once one enters into the Pure Land, because you have no distractions from other sufferings, it is easier to achieve the ultimate state of nirvana. So this monument has the references to the Pure Land through the lotus petals, but also here, just to jump ahead, at the very base of beneath the lotus petals, you have other lotuses that are carved in with lotuses springing out, not just the petals, but the actual lotus flower. And then you have these candles as well that are in front of the entire structure, kind of like the flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier. They're perpetually lit in their own way, in a symbolic way. The monument itself is very interesting. I could spend hours talking about it, but my purposes today are really to think about it as a kind of monument to the Buddhist dead at Rower that was expressed in ways that are very subtle, so that the Buddhist elements could almost be overlooked or be ignored unless you wanted to see them. On the right, we have a very interesting example of Buddhist visual culture in the camps. They're known colloquially as the Heart Mountain Sutra Stones. In 1956, in the cemetery of the Heart Mountain camps, a government worker accidentally discovered a tin container, or metal container, filled with thousands of these stones, each one having a Chinese character written on them. You know, in Japanese language, it's a mixture of Chinese characters and Japanese syllabary. So in Buddhist sutras, typically what one uses are only Chinese characters. So the government worker who found these sutra stones in 1956, he thought the best thing to do was just to give them to the farmer who owned the land where it was discovered on, rather than giving them to, you know, archaeologists or other more sort of scientifically minded people. So unfortunately, we have no really clear idea of how they were found or what the original state was like. But the estimate is that there were probably about 2,000 of these stones, originally all with different characters written on them. Not that you have 2,000 different characters, there were different characters, some of them could have been repeated. But the farmer who then owned these stones started giving them away as souvenirs to anybody who visited him. So after many years of doing this, there are only 656 of these stones left. Originally, there were several thousand of them. Now, as often happens with archaeological discoveries, it happens by accident. And eventually, there was a Japanese scholar who visited Heart Mountain, and he came across one of these stones, and he started to wonder whether or not they made sense together, and whether or not there was a Buddhist element there. So he collected all of the stones, which were like 656 at this point, put in all the characters into a database, and it came out that all the characters belonged to the Lotus Sutra. Although not all of the Lotus Sutra was represented, all the stones did fit into some part of the Lotus Sutra. So the consensus is that it was the Lotus Sutra. And then scholars started to think, well, who could have written it? And in the Heart Mountain camp records, there's only one person who was a Lotus Sutra specialist. He was a Nichiren priest, which takes the Lotus Sutra as their central text. A person named Reverend Murakita. And so some people attribute the authorship of these stones to this Reverend Murakita, a Nichiren priest who was an adherent of the Lotus Sutra. And here at the left, you see some of the stones and the scale. They're very tiny pebbles, really, with these characters written on them. So I'd like to end today by returning to the question that I had posed earlier, which is, what is Asian American art? And I am not prepared to answer that question, and I'm not claiming that the images that we've looked at can answer that question either, but it can start to help us think about a definition. And I hope that there are connections that we can draw between these images that we looked at today and other images that we've looked at in other presentations. Of course, this is Japanese American. We've looked primarily at Chinese American materials. But if we look at here, I just want to point out finally on the right, we have a drawing by the same Estelle Ichigo that I talked about earlier, the Caucasian wife of the Japanese American man who followed him into the Heart Mountain camps. And here she has done a very interesting sketch of the Heart Mountain Cemetery at the time. And you'll see here that there are no monuments to the Buddhist dead the same way that we have over here at Rower, which is very prominent. And so my theory is that the Heart Mountain suture stones were buried as a type of invisible monument to the Buddhist dead, so that nobody could actually accuse anybody of being disloyal because of their faith to Buddhism. And so here, returning back to the question of what is Asian American art, I think that it requires us to think about visuality, I might call it trans-Pacific visuality, in a certain way in which the hidden, the understated, and the outright invisible are as crucial as the exposed, the pronounced, and the obviously visible. Okay, so I'm going to end here. Thank you.